Arabut Lieutenant Pin Uladon Lebal Hamon. Ush Nadra Arabi Kohen Lebal.
One of the central questions of antiquity was a simple one. Did the ancient civilization known as the Phoenicians practice child sacrifice? Droves of ancient authors, from the Romans and Greeks to the authors of Old Testament books, such as Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and 2 Kings, told us in shocked and disgusted tones how the group variously known as the Carthaginians, Phoenicians, Punii, and Canaanites had sacrificed their children to the deity Baal Hamon. For most of modern history, we simply believe this was untrue, just yet another example of Roman xenophobic propaganda. For after all, no evidence had ever been found. But then it was. Tophets. Huge burial grounds, with dozens to hundreds of urns containing the cremated bones of young children and small animals, all across the Phoenician world, from the Levant to North Africa and Sicily, seemingly incontrovertible proof of ritualized child sacrifice. But after examining the evidence available, scholars have come to varied and often conflicting conclusions. Was this a child sacrifice site? Or was it simply a burial ground for children? Look at the evidence, and you decide.
It is believed that the Phoenicians sacrificed their infant children during times of strife, such as during times of war, famine, or pestilence, in order to appease their gods, Baal Hamon and his wife Tanit.
Sacrificial offerings were included in the burials, and the stelae found in the area were votive instead of funerary. The Carthaginian Tophet sites were most definitely sites of intentional child sacrifice. 1 or 2 children were cremated there each year.
There's literary evidence of the Phoenicians practicing child sacrifice, not only from the Greeks and the Romans, but from the Bible as well. There are several biblical references to the barbaric religious practices of the Canaanites, as the Phoenicians would have been known by biblical authors. Kings 16:30 says, "He walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Moreover, he consecrated also his son, making him pass through the fire according to the idols of the nations, which the Lord destroyed before the children of Israel." This is seemingly a reference to the fact that children who were sacrificed were cremated. These biblical references help reinforce the notion that these events actually did take place and that the Romans were not just writing propaganda.
The killing of a person to a named deity was unacceptable, it was immoral, and the Romans talked about it and listed the Carthaginians specifically as people who practiced human sacrifice to make the Carthaginians seem uncivilized and un-Roman.
As far as archaeology goes, along with the Tophet inscriptions, one of the more damning pieces of evidence for Phoenician child sacrifice is the Pozo Moro relief. Excavated in 1971 in Pozo Moro, Spain, the stone-carved relief dates to circa 500 to 490 BCE. This area would have been under Phoenician control at the time and certainly would have been reflective of larger Phoenician beliefs and customs. The stone-carved relief depicts what appears to be a seated, multi-headed figure, perhaps a monster or a deity, who is being offered a bowl with a small human-like figure inside of it, while the entity doing the offering appears to have the same head as the seated figure. This relief very well could be depicting the sacrifice of children to the god Baal Hamon, as it matches with the Greco-Roman and biblical descriptions of the practice.
Carthage has as many as 20,000 urns with both infant and animal bones, which were buried in the Tophet. Some of these urns contain only animal bones, some contain children and animals, and some contain only children. In all cases, these bodies had been cremated. To juxtapose the Tophet with regular cemeteries, the latter had both cremated and inhumed children's remains, so the fact that Tophets had expressly cremated children and animal remains is certainly something to be scrutinized. In terms of DNA and genetic testing, the teeth that have been found to indicate that all of the children cremated and buried were at least 2 months old and show no clear signs of defects. None of the remains were of newborns or stillborns. Remains from Carthage have been analyzed and indicate that all of the children were between 2 months and 5 years old. Of the DNA that has been sequenced, all are boys, although it is important to note that there is an extremely limited sample size. Biblical and classical sources seem to indicate that firstborn sons were sacrificed.
Infant mortality was high in Carthage, as it was in other areas of the Mediterranean, and as such, the infants buried in the Tophet most likely died from disease and dehydration. Our research has proven that stillborn children who died before they even had a chance to live and be sacrificed were buried at the Tophet. Therefore, the Tophet was used as a cemetery for infants and young children. If we haven't found sufficient evidence to completely disprove that child sacrifice did occur, which is based on insubstantial and biased evidence, we can say beyond a doubt that not all infant cremations were sacrificed, as some of the remains showed only prenatal growth.
After examining all of our evidence, it's really difficult to know whether or not the Phoenicians really did practice child sacrifice. Ultimately, one of the best things about scholarship is thinking critically about evidence. As there's no real scholarly consensus on this topic, we leave it to you to take the arguments and the evidence into consideration and decide for yourself the truth of what happened.